Good afternoon, everyone. It is a privilege to serve as the discussant for this interesting paper on bankruptcy reform and executive remuneration in India. I congratulate the authors for addressing an important governance issue using a rigorous empirical approach. My discussion will briefly summarize the paper, highlight its strengths, suggest a few extensions, and conclude with some questions for the authors. My presentation is organized into 4 parts. First, I summarize the motivation, research question, data, methodology, and findings. Next, I discuss the paper's academic and policy contributions. I then identify a few limitations and possible directions for future research. Finally, I conclude with my overall assessment and several discussion questions. The motivation behind this study is straightforward. When bankruptcy laws become stronger, creditors gain greater protection and managers face increased accountability. The authors examine whether these institutional changes influence executive compensation, particularly in financially distressed firms. The introduction of India's Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code provides an excellent natural setting to study this relationship. The central question is whether the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code reduced executive remuneration in financially distressed firms. The paper also investigates why this change occurs by examining whether stronger creditor rights alter managerial incentives. This connects bankruptcy reform directly with corporate governance and executive behavior. The literature offers 2 competing explanations. Agency theory predicts that stronger creditor monitoring reduces managerial discretion and therefore executive compensation. In contrast, retention theory argues that distressed firms may need to pay executives more to retain experienced leadership during difficult periods. The empirical analysis determines which explanation is better supported by the evidence. Based on the literature, the authors develop 2 competing hypotheses. The first predicts that stronger creditor rights increase monitoring, resulting in lower executive remuneration. The second suggests that financially distressed firms may increase executive pay to retain experienced managers during periods of uncertainty. The empirical analysis tests which of these competing explanations is supported by the data. The study uses firm-level data from the CMIE Prowess DX database, covering non-financial companies listed on the National Stock Exchange between 2010 and 2023. The final sample includes more than 7,000 firm-year observations. Because the data span both the pre- and post-IBC periods, the authors are able to compare changes over time using a large and reliable dataset. The research design is one of the paper's major strengths. The implementation of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code is treated as an external policy shock. Financially distressed firms serve as the treatment group, while similar non-distressed firms form the control group. This quasi-natural experiment provides a strong framework for identifying the effect of the reform. The authors combine propensity score matching with difference in differences analysis. Propensity score matching creates comparable treatment and control groups by reducing selection bias. Difference in differences then estimates the impact of the IBC by comparing changes before and after the reform. Together, these methods strengthen the credibility of the causal findings. The dependent variable is executive remuneration. The key independent variable is the interaction between financially distressed firms and the post-IBC period, which captures the impact of the reform. The study also controls for important firm characteristics, including profitability, leverage, size, growth, and governance variables, helping isolate the specific effect of the IBC on executive compensation. The results provide strong support for the first hypothesis. Executive remuneration declined significantly in financially distressed firms after the introduction of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. This suggests that stronger creditor rights and improved governance mechanisms constrained managerial discretion and aligned executive incentives more closely with stakeholder interests. An important contribution of the paper is explaining why executive compensation declined. The evidence suggests that the change is driven by increased creditor monitoring, greater financial discipline, and stronger governance during financial distress. This moves the discussion beyond simply reporting statistical results and provides insight into the underlying economic mechanism. The authors also perform several robustness checks to validate their findings. They employ alternative model specifications and sensitivity analyses, and the conclusions remain consistent. These additional tests increase confidence that the observed reduction in executive remuneration is attributable to the bankruptcy reforms rather than unrelated external factors. This paper contributes to both academic research and public policy. Academically, it extends the literature on corporate governance, executive compensation, and bankruptcy reform. From a policy perspective, it demonstrates that legal reforms can influence managerial behavior without directly regulating executive pay, reinforcing the importance of well-designed institutional frameworks. Overall, I believe this is a well-executed and policy-relevant study. The research question is timely, the empirical methodology is rigorous, and the findings are both statistically sound and practically meaningful. The paper successfully links bankruptcy reform with broader governance outcomes, making it valuable for researchers, policymakers, regulators, and corporate practitioners alike. Like any empirical study, this paper has certain limitations. The analysis focuses primarily on executive remuneration and does not examine other governance mechanisms that may also influence corporate behavior during insolvency. In addition, the study period ends before the recent legislative amendments, creating an opportunity to evaluate whether the latest reforms produce additional governance effects. This naturally leads to several future research opportunities. Researchers may examine how executive incentives interact with resolution professionals, the committee of creditors, and post-resolution firm performance. It would also be valuable to study whether the 2026 amendments further strengthen governance quality, creditor protection, and long-term corporate restructuring outcomes. Since this paper was completed, India enacted the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code Amendment Act, 2026. The amendment requires the National Company Law Tribunal to admit or reject insolvency applications within 14 days, strengthens oversight by the Committee of Creditors, and introduces stricter penalties for misconduct by resolution professionals. Although these amendments occurred after the study period, they open an important avenue for future empirical research. An important distinction should also be recognized. Once the corporate insolvency resolution process begins, directors generally lose operational control, and resolution professionals manage the corporate debtor. Their remuneration is governed under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code rather than Section 197 of the Companies Act. Interestingly, the 2026 amendment strengthened several governance provisions. This may indicate that policymakers considered the existing framework governing managerial remuneration to be broadly adequate while directing legislative attention toward improving insolvency administration and institutional efficiency. In conclusion, this paper makes a meaningful contribution to both corporate governance and bankruptcy literature. The empirical evidence demonstrates that stronger insolvency institutions can influence executive behavior through improved creditor oversight. With the recent legislative amendments, future studies have an excellent opportunity to examine how India's insolvency framework continues to evolve. Overall, I believe this paper provides a strong foundation for that next stage of research. Before concluding, I would like to leave one broader thought. Justice N. Anand Venkatesh in The Digital Narcissus reminds us that people often prefer comforting answers over challenging truths. As artificial intelligence becomes increasingly integrated into governance, auditing, and financial decision-making, this observation becomes highly relevant. Ethical judgment remains essential even in AI-enabled governance. I would like to leave the authors with 4 questions. They relate to industry effects, alternative measures of managerial risk-taking, CEO versus executive compensation, and the role of corporate governance. I believe these areas offer promising opportunities for extending this excellent research. This paper demonstrates how legal reform can influence executive behavior through stronger governance and creditor oversight. At the same time, it reminds us that effective governance depends not only on legislation but also on ethical leadership, institutional accountability, and sound professional judgment. Continued research will help us better understand how these factors work together to create sustainable corporate governance. Thank you very much for your attention. I once again congratulate the authors on an excellent and policy-relevant contribution to the literature. I also thank the conference organizers for the opportunity to serve as the discussant. I appreciate your attention and welcome any questions or comments.